Hey, welcome to The Night Scientist. I'm so happy you're here with me today. There's something truly magical about taking a moment to slow down and explore the gentle mysteries that surround us every single day. You know, we live in such a rush-filled world, don't we? Always moving, always busy, always looking ahead to the next thing. But sometimes, the most beautiful discoveries happen when we pause, take a deep breath, and really notice what's been there all along, quietly waiting for us to see it with fresh eyes. Today, I want to invite you to settle in, maybe grab a warm cup of tea or coffee, find your most comfortable spot, and join me on a journey that's going to change the way you see something so simple, so ordinary, that you probably walk past it hundreds of times without even thinking about it. We're going to explore together at our own peaceful pace, discovering layer after layer of wonder in the most unexpected places. This is your time to let your mind wander, to be curious like a child again, and to find joy in the small revelations that make life so beautifully intricate. Today, we are diving into the fascinating world of the life of a shadow, from object to ground. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Shadows? Really? But trust me on this one. What we're about to explore together is going to open your eyes to an entire universe of physics, art, psychology, and natural beauty that's been dancing around you your whole life. Shadows aren't just dark shapes on the ground. They're storytellers, they're artists, they're scientists in their own right. They reveal secrets about light, about space, about time itself. They connect us to the very foundations of how our universe works, and they do it all so quietly, so humbly, that we barely notice their extraordinary lives unfolding beside us every single day. So let's begin this gentle journey together, shall we? Imagine, if you will, the very first moment when light met an obstacle. Picture this scene in your mind like the opening of the most beautiful story ever told. In the beginning there was light, pure, radiant, travelling through space at incredible speed, carrying energy and warmth and life itself. This light, whether from our sun, or from a candle flame, or from the gentle glow of your bedroom lamp, moves in perfectly straight lines, like invisible highways stretching across the universe. It's confident, this light, knowing exactly where it's going, never wavering from its path. But then something wonderful happens. Something steps into light's path. Maybe it's your hand reaching for a book. Maybe it's a tree standing tall in a meadow. Maybe it's a child's toy left on a windowsill. And in that instant, the most beautiful relationship is born. The light can't bend around this obstacle, you see. It's too honest, too straightforward for that. Instead, it creates something entirely new, something that tells the story of both the light and the object that stopped it. It creates a shadow. Think about this for a moment. Every shadow you've ever seen is actually a portrait painted by light itself. It's light's way of showing us exactly where it couldn't go, creating a perfect silhouette of whatever stood in its way. The shadow becomes a record, a memory frozen in darkness, of that precise moment when light met something solid and real. And just like that, in the simplest possible way, we witness one of the fundamental forces of our universe at work. What's truly remarkable is how democratic this process is. Light doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if the object in its path is made of gold or cardboard, if it's worth $1 million, or if it's a fallen leaf. Light treats them all the same way, creating shadows with equal care and precision. The shadow of a queen's crown and the shadow of a child's crayon are born through exactly the same magical process. There's something profoundly beautiful about that equality, isn't there? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Shadows aren't just about absence. They're not simply places where light isn't. They're active participants in the story of illumination. Without shadows, light would have no meaning, no definition, no way to show us the texture and depth of our world. Shadows give light its vocabulary, its ability to speak to us about shape and distance and dimension. Consider how a photographer thinks about this relationship. They don't just hunt for light, they hunt for the interplay between light and shadow. They know that shadows can be just as powerful as the brightest highlights, sometimes even more so. A shadow can create mystery, drama, emotion, depth. It can hide details that make us curious, or reveal contours that make us gasp in appreciation. The most stunning photographs often owe their beauty not to what the light illuminates, but to what the shadows conceal and suggest. This dance between light and dark has been captivating human beings since we first learned to see. Our ancestors watched shadows move across cave walls and began to understand time itself. How the position of shadows could tell them when to hunt, when to sleep, when to prepare for winter. They watched their own shadows following them around and began to contemplate the nature of identity and existence. Am I separate from my shadow? Is my shadow part of me? These weren't just philosophical questions. They were the beginning of human consciousness exploring itself. Now, let's slow down and really understand how a shadow comes to life, step by gentle step. It's a process so elegant, so perfectly logical, that once you truly grasp it, you'll never look at shadows the same way again. And the beautiful thing is, you don't need to be a physicist to appreciate this miracle. You just need to be curious and willing to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. Light, as we've discovered, travels in straight lines. Scientists call these rays, and you can think of them as invisible arrows shooting through space, each one carrying a tiny piece of energy. When billions and billions of these light rays encounter an object, let's say a simple flower in a garden, something fascinating happens. The flower, being solid, blocks some of these rays from continuing their journey. But here's the key. It doesn't block all of them. Picture it like this. Imagine you're standing behind a garden hose that's spraying water in a wide fan pattern. If you hold up an umbrella in front of the spray, some of the water hits the umbrella and bounces off or is absorbed. But water continues to flow around the edges. Light behaves similarly, but with one crucial difference. Light travels in perfectly straight lines, so it can't curve around objects the way water might. Where the flower blocks the light rays, those rays simply stop. Where there's no flower, the rays continue on their merry way. This creates what we call a shadow region, an area where light rays from the source simply cannot reach because something solid is in their way. It's like the flower is casting a light shadow behind itself, creating a zone of absence in the otherwise illuminated world. And this zone, this absence, is what we perceive as the shadow. But shadows aren't just simple dark spots. Oh no! They have personality, they have character, they have different moods and qualities depending on their circumstances. The type of shadow that forms depends on the size of the light source, the distance between the light source and the object, and the distance between the object and the surface where the shadow falls. Each of these factors adds its own voice to the shadow's story. When the light source is very small, like a distant star or a tiny LED, we get what's called a sharp shadow. These shadows have clean, crisp edges because the light rays are all coming from essentially the same point. It's like having a single pencil drawing a line. The line is clear and definite, but when the light source is large, like the sun or a big fluorescent light, something much more interesting happens. Large light sources create shadows with both dark centers and softer, lighter edges. The dark center is called the umbra, from the Latin word meaning shade or shadow. This is where the object blocks light rays from every part of the light source. But around the edges we find the penumbra, meaning almost shadow. Here the object blocks light from some parts of the source but not others, creating a gradient from dark to light that gives shadows their gentle, soft edges. Think about your own shadow on a sunny day. Look closely at its edges and you'll notice they're not razor-sharp lines but soft transitions from dark to light. This is because the sun, despite appearing small in our sky, is actually enormous, much larger than Earth itself. Different parts of the sun are sending light rays from slightly different angles, and your body can only block some of them completely. The result is that beautiful, soft-edged shadow that follows you around, complete with its own subtle gradations and textures. Distance plays a magical role in this process too. The closer an object is to the light source, the larger its shadow becomes. The closer the object is to the surface where the shadow falls, the sharper the shadow becomes. This is why your shadow looks enormous and fuzzy when you hold your hand close to a flashlight, but becomes smaller and more defined as you move your hand away from the light and closer to the wall. This relationship between distance and shadow size has been useful to humans throughout history. Ancient Greek mathematicians used shadows to calculate the circumference of the Earth and the distance to the moon. They understood that shadows were not just curiosities but tools for measurement, ways of understanding space and proportion, and the geometry of the world around us. Just as people have different personalities, shadows come in many different varieties, each with its own characteristics and charm. Once you start paying attention, you'll begin to notice that the shadow world is incredibly diverse, full of subtle differences and surprising variations that make each shadow encounter unique and special. Let's start with what we might call the classic shadow, the kind you see when you're walking outside on a bright, clear day. This is typically a single light source shadow created by our sun, and it has that familiar sharp darkness in the center with soft, fuzzy edges. These shadows are confident and bold, moving across the ground with purpose as the sun travels across the sky. They're the shadows that taught us about time, the ones that ancient civilizations used to create sundials and track the seasons. But step inside, and shadows become much more complex and interesting. In our homes and offices, we rarely have just one light source. Instead, we have multiple lights: ceiling lights, lamps, windows, perhaps a TV screen or computer monitor. Each of these lights wants to create its own shadow, and when multiple light sources interact with the same object, something beautiful and complex happens. Multiple shadows can overlap, creating darker regions where several shadows meet, and lighter regions where only one or two shadows fall. Sometimes these multiple shadows create patterns that look like petals around a flower, or rays extending from a central point. The object casting the shadow remains the same, but the interplay of different light sources creates an entirely different shadow personality. Then there are what we might call the shy shadows, the ones created by very diffuse scattered light. Think about the gentle light that filters through a heavy overcast sky, or the soft illumination in a room with white walls and lots of reflected light. These conditions create shadows that are barely there, soft and subtle, more like gentle suggestions than bold statements. These shadows have their own quiet beauty, creating subtle depth and texture without drama or contrast. On the other end of the spectrum, we have dramatic shadows, the ones created by strong directional light. A flashlight in a dark room, sunlight streaming through Venetian blinds, the beam from a lighthouse cutting through darkness. These lights create shadows with personality and attitude, shadows that can seem almost alive with their sharp contrasts and bold shapes. Some of the most enchanting shadows are the ones that move and dance. Think about the shadows cast by tree branches swaying in the wind, creating ever-changing patterns on the ground below, or the shadows in a room lit by candlelight, flickering and shifting with every tiny movement of the flame. These dynamic shadows remind us that light and shadow are not static things, but living, breathing elements of our environment. Water creates some of the most magical shadows of all. When light passes through water, it bends and refracts, creating shadows that seem to shimmer and dance even when the water is perfectly still. Swimming pool shadows, aquarium shadows, shadows cast through a glass of water. These all have a liquid quality that seems to move and flow even when everything else is motionless. And then there are the impossible shadows, the ones that seem to defy our expectations and challenge our understanding. Shadows cast by transparent objects can create surprising patterns. A clear glass can cast a distinct shadow because even transparent materials interact with light in complex ways, bending it, reflecting it, absorbing tiny amounts of it. These shadows teach us that even things we can see through have substance and presence in the world of light. Coloured shadows are another delightful surprise. When white light passes through coloured filters or reflects off coloured surfaces, the shadows themselves can take on colour. The shadow of a red object in red light might appear deep crimson, while the same object in blue light might cast a purple shadow. This happens because shadows aren't just the absence of light, they're the presence of different light, light that has been filtered and modified by its journey through our complex, colourful world. Now that we understand how shadows are born and the many forms they can take, let's talk about the art of really seeing them. Because here's the thing, shadows have been hiding in plain sight our entire lives, and most of us have trained ourselves not to notice them. We look through shadows to see what they're attached to, but we rarely stop to appreciate the shadows themselves. Today, that changes. Learning to see shadows is like learning a new language, the language of light and form and space. Once you become fluent in this language, the world becomes a much richer, more interesting place. You'll start to notice the subtle ways shadows define the shape of objects, how they reveal texture and surface details that would otherwise be invisible, how they create depth and dimension in what might otherwise appear flat and uninteresting. Start with your own shadow. Right now, wherever you are, look around and find your shadow. Really look at it. Notice how it copies your general shape but simplifies all the details. Your shadow doesn't show the colour of your clothes or the expression on your face, but it captures something else: your gesture, your posture, the way you hold yourself in space. In many ways, your shadow reveals your mood and personality more clearly than a photograph might. Watch how your shadow changes as you move. Raise your arm and see how instantly, without any delay, your shadow arm rises too. Wave your fingers and watch shadow fingers wave back. This immediate responsiveness is one of the most magical things about shadows. They're perfect mirrors of movement, translating three-dimensional motion into two-dimensional art in real time. Now look at the shadows around you. If you're indoors, notice how every object, every book, every plant, every piece of furniture has its own shadow companion. These shadows are having their own quiet conversations, overlapping and interacting in ways that create subtle patterns and relationships. A coffee cup's shadow might touch the shadow of a pen, creating a temporary connection between two objects that aren't actually touching at all. If you're near a window, spend some time watching how shadows change throughout the day. The shadows cast by the same objects will move and transform as the sun travels across the sky. A shadow that points north in the morning will point east by evening. A shadow that's short and stubby at noon will be long and elegant in late afternoon. This slow-motion dance of shadows is one of the most reliable ways we have of tracking the passage of time. Pay attention to shadow textures. Smooth objects create smooth-edge shadows, but textured objects create textured shadows. The shadow of a tree isn't just a tree-shaped dark spot. It's a complex pattern that reveals the intricate branching structure, the density of leaves, the way the tree moves and breathes in the wind. The shadow tells a story about the tree that you might miss if you were only looking at the tree itself. Look for shadows within shadows. A large shadow might contain smaller, lighter areas where reflected light finds its way in. These shadow details add complexity and interest, creating miniature landscapes of light and dark within the broader shadow shape. Artists have always been fascinated by these subtle variations, using them to create depth and realism in their work. Notice how shadows interact with different surfaces. A shadow on grass looks different from the same shadow on concrete, which looks different from the same shadow on snow. The surface receiving the shadow becomes part of the shadow's personality, adding its own texture and character to the final image. This is why photographers and cinematographers spend so much time thinking about not just the objects casting shadows, but the surfaces those shadows will fall upon. Learn to see shadows as design elements. In any well-lit space, shadows are working just as hard as the objects themselves to create visual interest and balance. They provide contrast. They separate objects from their backgrounds. They create rhythm and pattern. Interior designers understand this instinctively, using shadows as tools to make spaces feel more dynamic and visually appealing. Start collecting shadow moments in your memory. That perfect shadow cast by afternoon light through Venetian blinds, creating stripes of light and dark across a wall. The intricate shadow of bicycle spokes creating a geometric mandala on the sidewalk. The soft, enormous shadow of an airplane passing overhead, racing across fields and buildings. These shadow moments are gifts, small pieces of everyday magic that cost nothing but attention to enjoy. Long before we had clocks or watches or smartphones to tell us the time, humans had shadows, and what remarkable timekeepers they were. Precise, reliable, never needing batteries or winding or updates. The relationship between shadows and time is one of the most practical and poetic connections in all of physics, a daily reminder that we live on a spinning planet orbiting a star. Think about this remarkable fact. Every shadow you see is actually a sundial. Every vertical object, a tree, a flagpole, even you standing in your yard, is constantly telling time with its shadow. The shadow points in different directions and has different lengths at different times of day, creating a natural clock that our ancestors relied on for thousands of years.
In the early morning, when the sun is low on the eastern horizon, shadows are long and point toward the west. As the sun climbs higher, shadows grow shorter and begin to swing around like the hands of a clock. At solar noon, the moment when the sun is highest in the sky, shadows are at their shortest, pointing due north in the northern hemisphere and due south in the southern hemisphere. Then, as afternoon progresses, shadows lengthen again and swing round toward the east. This daily shadow dance has been humanity's most reliable way of tracking time for most of our history. Ancient civilizations built elaborate sundials, some as large as buildings, with carefully calibrated markings that could tell time accurately to within minutes. These weren't just functional tools, they were works of art, celebrations of humanity's growing understanding of astronomy and mathematics. But shadows don't just tell us the time of day, they also tell us the time of year. The length and direction of shadows change with the seasons because the Earth's axis is tilted relative to its orbit around the Sun. In summer, when your part of Earth is tilted toward the Sun, shadows are shorter at midday. In winter, when your part of Earth is tilted away from the Sun, midday shadows are longer. Ancient astronomers used this seasonal shadow change to determine the exact dates of solstices and equinoxes. They built stone monuments and shadow calendars that could predict these important dates years in advance. Stonehenge, the pyramids of Egypt. Temples throughout the ancient world, many of these structures were designed as sophisticated shadow-casting devices. Permanent calendars written in stone and light. Even today, in our digital age, shadows continue to be remarkably accurate timekeepers. If you know your latitude and have a good map, you can determine the time to within a few minutes just by measuring shadows. This ancient skill has saved lost hikers and sailors when their modern devices failed them. There's something deeply satisfying about reading time from shadows. It connects us to the fundamental rhythms of our planet and our solar system. When you check the time on your phone, you're reading an arbitrary human construct. When you read time from a shadow, you're reading the actual position of Earth in space, the real relationship between your location and the Sun. It's like having a direct conversation with the cosmos. Shadows also reveal the passage of time in more subtle ways. Watch a shadow for an hour, and you'll see it move perceptibly across the ground. This visible representation of time's passage can be almost meditative, a gentle reminder to slow down and appreciate the present moment. Many people find shadow watching to be a form of natural mindfulness practice, a way of synchronizing their internal rhythms with the larger rhythms of the universe. The speed of shadow movement changes throughout the day too. In early morning and late afternoon, when the sun is low and moving rapidly across the sky relative to the horizon, shadows move quickly across the ground. Around midday, when the sun is high and its apparent motion is mostly vertical, shadows move more slowly. This variable speed of shadow movement is another subtle indicator of our planet's rotation and our position in the solar system. Different latitudes experience different shadow behaviors throughout the year. Near the equator, shadows are relatively consistent year-round, but as you move toward the poles, seasonal shadow variations become more dramatic. In the far north or south, winter shadows can stretch for hundreds of yards, while summer shadows can be almost non-existent at midday. This relationship between shadows, time, and geography has shaped human culture in profound ways. Many traditional societies organized their daily activities around shadow patterns. They knew that when the shadow of a particular tree reached a certain rock, it was time for the afternoon meal. When the shadow of a mountain touched the village well, it was time to bring the animals inside for the night. These shadow cues were woven into the fabric of daily life, creating a natural rhythm that connected human activity to cosmic cycles. Now that we've begun to understand the delicate relationship between light and shadow, let's take a closer look at how these dark companions actually come to life. Picture yourself standing in your garden on a bright summer morning, coffee cup in hand, watching as the sun slowly climbs higher in the sky. As you stand there, you're not just witnessing the arrival of day, you're observing one of nature's most elegant performances, the birth of countless shadows. Every shadow begins with a simple story. Light traveling in a straight line encounters an obstacle. But oh, what a beautiful complexity unfolds from this simple beginning. When light meets an object, it doesn't simply stop it, creates a tale written in gradients of darkness, a story told in the language of physics, but felt in the poetry of everyday experience. Imagine light as a river, flowing steadily through space. When this river meets a boulder, let's say a tree in your yard, it doesn't disappear. Instead, it parts around the obstacle, creating a space behind it where the water cannot reach. This space, this absence of flowing water, is like the shadow cast by the tree. But unlike water, light doesn't flow around objects in quite the same way. Light travels in perfectly straight lines, and when something blocks its path, it creates a region where those light rays simply cannot go. The fascinating thing about this process is that not all shadows are created equal. When you hold your hand up to a bright, focused light source like a flashlight or a laser pointer, you create what scientists call a sharp shadow, one with clearly defined edges. But when you hold that same hand up to a larger light source, like a lamp with a big shade or the sun itself, something magical happens. The shadow becomes softer, its edges less defined, almost as if it's breathing. This breathing quality comes from the fact that larger light sources create what we call partial shadows alongside complete shadows. Think of it this way: when you're standing under a large umbrella in the rain, there's the area directly under the umbrella where you're completely dry. And then there's the area around the edges where some raindrops might still reach you. Shadows work in much the same way. The completely dark part of a shadow, where no light reaches at all, is called the umbra. This word comes from Latin, meaning shade or ghost. And there's something almost supernatural about these regions of complete darkness. When you see a total solar eclipse, you're experiencing the umbra of the moon's shadow as it passes across the earth. For those few precious minutes, day becomes night, and you're standing in the moon's ghostly embrace. But surrounding every umbra is its gentler cousin, the penumbra, the partial shadow where some light still reaches, but not all of it. The word penumbra also comes from Latin, meaning almost shadow, and it captures perfectly that in-between quality of these transitional regions. In the penumbra, light and shadow dance together, creating those soft, gradual transitions that make shadows so visually appealing. To truly understand how these different types of shadows form, let's take a leisurely walk through the process. Imagine you're an artist setting up a still life, and you've placed a beautiful round apple on your table. You have two different light sources to choose from, a small, intense spotlight and a large, soft studio light. Let's see what happens when you illuminate your apple with each one. With the spotlight, our small, intense light source, the light rays hitting your apple come from essentially one direction. When the apple blocks these rays, it creates a shadow with very sharp, well-defined edges. The umbra behind the apple is quite dark and distinct, and there's very little penumbra. It's a dramatic shadow, the kind that creates strong contrasts and bold statements in photographs and paintings. Now, let's switch to the large studio light. Suddenly, everything changes. The light is now coming from many slightly different directions because the source is large. Some rays graze the top of the apple, others skim along its sides, and still others approach from various angles. When the apple blocks these rays, it can't block all of them completely in most areas. This creates a large, soft penumbra surrounding a smaller, softer umbra. The shadow breathes and flows with gentle gradations that seem to whisper rather than shout. This principle explains why shadows look different throughout the day. In the early morning or late evening, when the sun appears large and soft on the horizon, our shadows are gentle and diffused. But at midday, when the sun appears as a smaller, more intense point of light high in the sky, our shadows become sharper and more defined. It's as if the sun itself is adjusting the mood of all the shadows on Earth. Throughout the day, the size of shadows also tells a fascinating story about the relationship between light sources, objects, and the surfaces on which shadows fall. This relationship follows rules that are both mathematically precise and intuitively beautiful. When you hold your hand close to a wall with a light behind you, your shadow appears large. Move your hand closer to the light source, and the shadow grows even larger. Move it closer to the wall, and the shadow shrinks. This happens because shadows are created by the straight-line paths that light cannot take. When your hand is close to the light source, it blocks light rays that would spread out over a large area of the wall. When your hand is close to the wall, it blocks light rays that haven't had much chance to spread out yet. It's like the difference between holding your hand close to a flashlight and creating a giant shadow puppet on a distant wall, versus holding your hand close to the wall and creating a small, detailed shadow. The mathematics behind this relationship is elegantly simple. The size of a shadow is proportional to the distance from the object to the surface it falls on, and inversely proportional to the distance from the light source to the object. But don't let the mathematical language fool you. This is something your brain understands intuitively. You've been unconsciously calculating these relationships your entire life. Every time you've positioned your hand to create shadow puppets or moved closer to a lamp to get better light for reading. One of the most enchanting secrets about shadows is that they're not actually black. This might surprise you, especially if you've always thought of shadows as simply the absence of light. But take a moment to really look at the shadows around you right now. Look at the shadow cast by a book on your desk, or the shadow of a tree. Outside your window, do you see what I mean? These shadows aren't true black. They're filled with subtle colors and gentle variations in tone. This colorful nature of shadows reveals something profound about the world of light around us. See, very rarely are we in environments with just one light source. Even when we think we have a single lamp illuminating a room, there's usually light bouncing off the walls, the ceiling, other objects, and even coming from other rooms or through windows. All of this bouncing, reflecting, indirect light contributes to filling in our shadows with gentle illumination. Let's explore this step by step, like following a trail of breadcrumbs through an enchanted forest. When direct light from your reading lamp hits your book and creates a shadow on your desk, that shadow isn't plunged into complete darkness. Instead, it's softly illuminated by light that has bounced off your white ceiling, your pale walls, and even your own clothing. This indirect light is usually much cooler in color temperature than the direct light, which is why shadows often appear slightly blue or purple compared to the warm, directly lit areas. This principle becomes especially beautiful outdoors. On a clear day, objects in direct sunlight are illuminated by the warm, yellowish light of the sun. But the shadows of these same objects are illuminated by light from the blue skylight that has been scattered by tiny particles in our atmosphere. This is why, If you've ever taken photographs outdoors, you might have noticed that shadows have a distinctly blue tint. It's not your camera playing tricks on you. It's the actual color of skylight gently filling in the darker areas. The phenomenon becomes even more magical during the golden hour, that precious time just after sunrise or before sunset, when the sun hangs low in the sky. During these moments, the direct sunlight becomes very warm and golden, sometimes even orange or red. But the sky remains blue, creating shadows that are not just cooler in brightness, but dramatically cooler in color. The contrast between the warm light and cool shadows during golden hour is what makes photographs taken at this time so visually stunning and emotionally compelling. But the colors in shadows don't stop there. They're also influenced by the colors of nearby objects through a process called color reflection or color bounce. Imagine you're sitting next to a red brick wall on a sunny day. The sunlight hitting that wall doesn't just bounce back as white light, it picks up some of the red color from the bricks and carries it with it. This reddish light then gently illuminates the shadows on your side of the wall, giving them a warm, rosy tint. Artists have known about this phenomenon for centuries. If you look at the work of the Impressionist painters, you'll notice that they rarely used black or gray for shadows. Instead, they painted shadows in purples, blues, and other colors that reflected the complex interplay of light bouncing around in the real world. Claude Monet, for instance, was famous for painting the shadows of haystacks in deep purples and blues, capturing not just what these shadows looked like, but what they actually were, as illuminated by cool skylight rather than warm sunlight. The temperature of light also plays a crucial role in how we perceive shadow colors. Light temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin, and it describes whether light appears warm, yellowish, reddish, or cool, bluish white. Candlelight is very warm, around 1900 Kelvin, with a deep orange glow. Sunlight at noon is around 5500 Kelvin, appearing quite white. The blue sky can be as cool as 10,000 Kelvin or more, appearing distinctly blue. When we have multiple light sources with different temperatures illuminating the same scene, the shadows become a canvas for this interplay of warm and cool light. The areas lit directly by the warm source appear yellowish or orange, while the shadows, lit by the cooler source, appear blue or purple in comparison. This isn't just a technical curiosity. It's something that affects how we feel about spaces and scenes. Warm shadows feel cozy and intimate, like those cast by firelight or candlelight in the evening. Cool shadows feel fresh and energizing, like those cast by bright daylight streaming through a window. Understanding this emotional quality of shadow colors can help you create the mood you want in your own living spaces, simply by choosing light sources with appropriate color temperatures. The interaction between shadow colors and human perception runs even deeper than this. Our brains are constantly adjusting what we see to account for different lighting conditions, a process called color constancy. This means that a white piece of paper looks white to us whether it's in direct sunlight, in the shade, or under artificial light, even though it's actually reflecting very different colors of light in each situation. But our color constancy system isn't perfect, and this is where shadows become particularly interesting, because shadows represent areas where the lighting conditions are dramatically different from the directly lit areas. They often reveal colors that our brain's automatic adjustments usually hide from us. When you really look at shadows, you train yourself to see them as they actually are, rather than as your brain thinks they should be. Open up a whole new world of color and beauty that was there all along, just waiting to be noticed. As we delve deeper into the life of shadows, we encounter one of their most playful and complex behaviors. What happens when multiple light sources create multiple shadows from the same object? This phenomenon transforms our simple understanding of shadows as singular, well-behaved dark patches into something far more dynamic and fascinating, a choreographed dance of light and darkness that follows rules as elegant as they are surprising. Picture yourself walking down a city street at night, passing under a series of streetlights. As you move, you're not casting just one shadow, you're casting multiple shadows, each created by a different light source, each pointing in a different direction, each with its own character and intensity. These shadows interact with each other in ways that create an ever-changing pattern of light and darkness around your feet. It's like being the conductor of an orchestra where the musicians are rays of light and the music they create is written in shadows. To understand this dance, let's slow down and examine what happens when just two light sources illuminate a single object. Imagine you're in your living room in the evening with two lamps turned on, one on a side table to your left and another floor lamp to your right. Place a coffee mug on the table between them and watch what happens. The mug doesn't cast just one shadow, it casts two distinct shadows, one created by each lamp. But here's where it gets interesting. These two shadows don't just sit politely next to each other. Where one shadow falls, it blocks the light from reaching that area, but the other lamp might still be able to illuminate that same spot. This creates regions of complete shadow where both lamps are blocked, partial shadow where only one lamp is blocked, and full light where both lamps can reach. The result is a complex pattern that's beautiful in its mathematical precision. Each shadow has its own penumbra and umbra, and where these regions overlap, they create what scientists call shadow addition. In areas where both umbras overlap, you get the darkest shadows through absence of light from both sources. Where an umbra from one source overlaps with a penumbra from another, you get medium-toned shadows. And where only the penumbras overlap, you get the lightest shadows, just barely darker than the fully illuminated areas. This principle becomes even more enchanting when you consider that each light source might have a different color temperature or intensity. Perhaps your side table lamp has a warm, yellowish bulb, while your floor lamp has a cool, bluish LED. Now your multiple shadows aren't just varying in darkness, they're varying in color. The shadow cast by the warm lamp, and thus illuminated only by the cool lamp, will appear blue, while the shadow cast by the cool lamp, illuminated only by the warm lamp, will appear yellow. Where both shadows overlap, you might see a purple or neutral gray, depending on how the colors mix. Professional photographers and filmmakers use this principle of multiple shadows to create mood and visual interest in their work. They might use several lights of different colors to create shadows that tell a story through color alone. A warm key light might represent safety and home, while a cool fill light creates shadows that suggest mystery or uncertainty. The interplay between these colored shadows becomes part of the narrative itself. But multiple shadows aren't just about artificial light sources. Nature creates some of the most beautiful examples of shadow interaction. Consider what happens during a partial solar eclipse, when the moon partially blocks the sun. If you hold up your hand during this time, you might notice something strange. Your shadow has multiple edges, some sharper than others. This happens because different parts of the sun's surface are being blocked to different degrees, creating multiple, slightly offset light sources. Even on an ordinary day, the sun and sky act as different light sources. The sun provides direct, warm illumination, while the blue sky provides diffuse, cool illumination. Objects outdoors are constantly casting to shadows. A sharp, warm-toned shadow created by the direct sunlight, and a softer, cool-toned shadow created by the skylight. These shadows usually overlap so completely that we perceive them as a single shadow, but they're actually two distinct phenomena working together. The mathematics of multiple shadows follows predictable rules, but the visual results can be surprisingly complex and beautiful when 3 or more light sources are involved. The pattern of overlapping shadows can create intricate designs that change dramatically with small movements of either the lights or the object casting the shadows. This is why stage lighting designers often use multiple spotlights to create dynamic, ever-changing shadow patterns that add visual energy to performances. One of the most delightful aspects of multiple shadows is how they respond to movement. Walk past those 2 lamps in your living room and watch how your shadows swing back and forth like pendulums, sometimes merging into one dark shadow, sometimes separating into distinct shapes, sometimes creating the illusion that you're being followed by multiple shadow versions of yourself. Each light source creates its own version of your shadow, and as you move, these shadow selves dance around each other in patterns that are both predictable and endlessly entertaining. The interaction of multiple shadows also reveals something profound about the nature of darkness itself. We often think of shadows as things, as objects or entities that exist in the world. But multiple shadows show us that darkness is really just the absence of light, and that this absence can have degrees and qualities just as nuanced as light itself. A shadow isn't a thing. It's the shape that light cannot reach, and when multiple light sources are involved, this shape becomes a complex, three-dimensional sculpture carved out of illumination. There's something almost hypnotic about watching shadows move. Perhaps you've found yourself staring out a window, mesmerized by the shadow of tree branches swaying in the breeze, their dark silhouettes dancing across your wall in an ever-changing pattern. Or maybe you've been captivated by your own shadow as you walk, stretching long in the evening sun, then shortening as you move under a streetlight, creating a rhythm of expansion and contraction that matches your steps. Moving shadows reveal aspects of light and physics that static shadows keep hidden. When shadows move, they become storytellers, narrating the motion of both the objects that cast them and the light sources that create them. They transform the invisible movement of our planet, the imperceptible dance of Earth around the sun, into something we can see and feel in our everyday experience. Let's begin with the grandest shadow movement of all, the daily progression of shadows cast by the sun. Every morning, as our planet turns its face toward the sun, shadows begin their daily journey across the landscape. In the early morning, when the sun sits low on the eastern horizon, shadows stretch long and dramatic toward the west. They're like fingers of darkness reaching across the earth, pointing away from the promise of the new day. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, these shadows begin to shorten and change direction. It's a slow, almost meditative process, so gradual that you don't notice it happening unless you deliberately pay attention. But if you place a stick in the ground and mark the tip of its shadow every hour, you'll trace out a curved path that tells the story of our planet's rotation and the sun's apparent movement across the sky. By noon, when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky, shadows reach their shortest length of the day. They huddle close to the objects that cast them, like shy creatures seeking shelter. Then, as afternoon arrives and the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, shadows start to lengthen again, this time reaching toward the east. By evening, they've grown long and dramatic once more. But now they point in the opposite direction from where they started. This daily dance of shadows has been humanity's timekeeper for millennia. Ancient civilizations built sundials that used the predictable movement of shadows to tell time with remarkable accuracy. The shadow of a no-manner simple stick or triangular piece of stone would move across marked divisions that corresponded to the hours of the day. In essence, these ancient timekeepers were using the shadow of a small object to read the giant clock of Earth's rotation. But shadows don't just move because of the sun's apparent motion across the sky. They also change throughout the year as our planet orbits the sun and our local star appears to take different paths across the sky with the changing seasons. In summer, when the sun travels high overhead, shadows are short even at the beginning and end of the day. In winter, when the sun stays lower in the sky, shadows remain long throughout the day, creating a landscape painted in extended silhouettes. This seasonal movement of shadows affects more than just our perception of time. It influences architecture, agriculture, and even our emotions. Ancient builders understood shadow movement intimately, designing structures that would provide shade in summer when the sun was high, but allow warming sunlight to enter in winter when the sun was lower. Modern sustainable architecture still uses these same principles, creating buildings that work with a natural movement of shadows to maintain comfortable temperatures. Year-round. The movement of shadows also reveals the three-dimensional nature of the objects that cast them. When a tree sways in the wind, its shadow doesn't just move, it changes shape, revealing the complex geometry of branches and leaves that might be difficult to perceive when looking directly at the tree. The shadow becomes like an X-ray, showing us the internal structure and movement patterns of the tree in a way that direct observation might miss. This principle becomes especially fascinating when we consider moving mechanical objects. Watch the shadow of a bicycle wheel as it turns, and you'll see spokes appear and disappear in rhythmic patterns. The shadow of a rotating fan blade creates flowing curves that visualize the circular motion in elegant arcs. These moving shadows transform mechanical motion into visual poetry, making the invisible forces of rotation and oscillation visible to our eyes. Water creates some of the most beautiful moving shadows. When sunlight shines through moving water, whether it's waves on a lake, ripples in a swimming pool, or even water flowing from a garden hose, it creates patterns of light and shadow that dance and flow across nearby surfaces. These caustic patterns, as they're technically known, are created by the water acting like a moving lens, focusing and dispersing light in constantly changing ways. The physics behind these water shadows is elegantly complex. Each ripple and wave in the water surface acts like a tiny magnifying glass, concentrating light rays into bright lines and leaving darker areas in between. As the water moves, these focal points move too, creating the shimmering, ever-changing patterns that have inspired artists and poets for centuries. The ancient Greeks believed that these dancing water shadows were messages from the gods, patterns of divine communication written in light and darkness. Moving shadows also play with our perception of time in fascinating ways. A shadow that moves quickly, like the shadow cast by a passing car or a bird in flight, seems to compress time, creating a sense of urgency or excitement. Slowly moving shadows, like those cast by drifting clouds or swaying trees, have a calming, meditative quality that seems to slow down our perception of time passing. This temporal quality of moving shadows has been used by artists and designers, to create specific emotional effects. Slow-moving shadow patterns in interior spaces can create a sense of tranquility and natural rhythm, while rapidly changing shadow patterns can energize a space and create visual excitement. Some modern buildings incorporate kinetic elements specifically designed to create interesting moving shadow patterns as part of their architectural experience. Perhaps most remarkably, moving shadows can reveal motion that's too slow or too fast for us to perceive directly. Time-lapse photography of shadow movement can show us the graceful dance of flowers following the sun throughout the day, or the slow, stately movement of shadows across mountain landscapes as weather systems pass overhead. High-speed photography can capture the swift movement of shadows cast by hummingbird wings or falling raindrops, revealing delicate patterns of motion that exist for only fractions of a second. Within every shadow lies a hidden mathematical universe, a realm where geometry comes alive in the interplay between light, objects, and the surfaces that receive these silhouettes of darkness. When we begin to understand the geometric principles that govern shadow formation, we unlock a deeper appreciation for the elegant mathematical relationships that surround us every day. Written in the language of light and shadow, let's start our geometric journey with the simplest case: a point, light source, an object, and a flat surface. Imagine holding a small, bright LED light in your hand, shining it on a coffee cup sitting on a table. From the light, straight lines, what mathematicians call rays, travel outward in all directions. Some of these rays hit the coffee cup and are blocked. The rays that just graze the edges of the cup define the boundaries of the shadow cast on the table. This creates what's known as a shadow cone, an invisible three-dimensional cone of darkness that extends from the light source, through the edges of the object, and onto any surface that intercepts it. The shape and size of the shadow depend entirely on where this shadow cone intersects with the receiving surface. If the table is close to the cup, the shadow is small. If we could somehow project the shadow onto a wall much farther away, it would be much larger, but it would have exactly the same shape. This relationship follows the principles of similar triangles, one of the fundamental concepts in geometry. The ratio between the size of the object and the size of its shadow equals the ratio between the distance from the light to the object and the distance from the light to the shadow surface. This might sound complex, but it's actually something your brain calculates instinctively every time you make shadow puppets on the wall, automatically adjusting your hand position to make the shadow larger or smaller. The beauty of this geometric relationship becomes even more apparent when we consider objects with different shapes. A sphere always casts a circular shadow when lit by a point source, regardless of the angle of the light. This is because a sphere looks the same from every direction, what mathematicians call rotational symmetry. A cube, on the other hand, can cast shadows that are squares, rectangles, hexagons, or even triangles, depending on the angle of the light source. This geometric versatility of cube shadows reveals something profound about three-dimensional shapes and their two-dimensional projections. When light hits a cube from different angles, it's essentially creating different cross-sections of the cube's three-dimensional form. Each shadow is like a slice through the cube, showing us how the object would look if we could flatten it from that particular direction. The cone, cylinder, and sphere, what ancient mathematicians called the perfect solids, each have their own characteristic shadow signatures. A cone can cast shadows that are circles, ellipses, parabolas, or hyperbolas, depending on the angle of the light. These curves, known as conic sections, were studied extensively by ancient Greek mathematicians, who probably never realized they were investigating the same curves that shadows naturally create every day. A cylinder creates shadows that can be rectangles or ellipses, and the transition between these shapes as the light angle changes reveals the mathematical relationship between circles and ellipses. An ellipse is simply what you get when you slice through a cylinder at an angle, or when you project a circle onto a surface that isn't perpendicular to the circle's plane. Every time you see the elliptical shadow of a round object, you're witnessing this fundamental geometric transformation. When we move from simple geometric shapes to more complex objects, the mathematics becomes more intricate, but no less beautiful. Consider the shadow cast by a tree. The complex branching structure of the tree creates a shadow. That's like a two-dimensional map of the tree's three-dimensional architecture. Each branch, each cluster of leaves, contributes to the overall shadow pattern according to the same geometric principles that govern simple shapes. The fascinating thing about complex shadows like those cast by trees is that they contain information about parts of the object that might not be visible from your viewpoint, because light comes from a different direction than your line of sight. The shadow can reveal branches that are hidden behind others, or show the overall structure of the tree in a way that direct observation might not. This principle has practical applications in many fields. Archaeologists sometimes use shadow analysis to identify buried structures or landscape features that aren't visible from ground level. Medical imaging techniques, like X-rays, are essentially sophisticated shadow casting systems that use the shadows cast by different tissues to reveal internal structures. Even astronomers use shadow techniques, observing the shadows cast by moons on planetary surfaces to learn about the three-dimensional topography of distant worlds. The geometry of shadows also reveals the mathematical concept of perspective projection. When a three-dimensional object casts a shadow on a two-dimensional surface, it's undergoing the same mathematical transformation that artists use when they draw three-dimensional scenes on flat canvases. The shadow is a natural perspective drawing, created by light rather than by an artist's hand. This connection between shadows and perspective explains why shadows often look so convincing and three-dimensional, even though they're actually flat. Our brains are highly sophisticated at interpreting perspective cues, and shadows provide these cues naturally. When you see a shadow cast by a three-dimensional object, your brain automatically reconstructs information about the object's form, height, and position in space. The mathematical relationships in shadow geometry also explain some optical illusions and perceptual tricks. For example, shadows can make flat objects appear three-dimensional, or make three-dimensional objects appear flat, depending on the lighting conditions and viewing angle. Artists and designers often use these geometric principles deliberately to create visual effects that play with our perception of depth and form. As we delve deeper into shadow geometry, we discover that the mathematics involved connects to some of the most advanced concepts in mathematics and physics. The behavior of light rays follows the same mathematical principles that govern the paths of particles in physics. The optimization of routes in network theory, and even the flow of information in complex systems, shadows, in their quiet way, are demonstrating some of the fundamental mathematical principles that govern our universe. Step into a forest on a summer morning, and you'll witness one of nature's most intricate shadow theaters. The canopy above creates a living cathedral of light and darkness, where every leaf becomes both a shadow caster and a shadow receiver in an endless dance of illumination. This is where shadows truly come alive, not as mere absence of light, but as active participants in the grand symphony of life itself. The forest understands shadows in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. Each tree has spent decades, sometimes centuries, learning to work with the shadows cast by its neighbors. The mighty oak doesn't simply tolerate the shade of the towering pine beside it. It has grown and shaped itself in response to that shadow, creating a partnership written in wood and leaf that speaks of patience and adaptation beyond human comprehension. Imagine, if you will, being a young seedling on the forest floor. You're surrounded by giants whose shadows create a world of perpetual twilight. The light that filters down to you has been filtered and refracted dozens of times, passing through layer after layer of leaves, each one taking its share of the sun's energy before passing the remainder downward. This light, when it finally reaches you, is not the harsh, direct sunlight of an open field, but something softer, gentler, more complex. This is dappled light, and it carries within it the signature of every leaf it has encountered on its journey. From sky to soil, scientists have discovered that plants can actually read these light signatures, understanding not just how much light they're receiving, but what kind of light it is, and what that tells them about their environment. A seedling, bathed in green-tinted light, knows it's beneath other plants. Light filtered through mature leaves carries different information than light filtered through young ones. The forest floor exists in what we might call a shadow ecosystem, where life has adapted not just to live in darkness, but to thrive in. The specific quality of darkness that forest shadows provide, the delicate ferns that carpet the ground beneath the great trees, are not struggling in the shadows. They are perfectly adapted to this filtered light environment. They're broad, flat. Fronds are designed to capture and make use of every photon that makes its way through the canopy above. Some plants have evolved what botanists call shade tolerance, but this term perhaps doesn't capture the full beauty of what's happening. These plants haven't merely learned to tolerate shadows, they've learned to speak the language of shadows, to read the subtle variations in light quality and intensity, and to respond with a sophistication that rivals any human technology. Consider the forest understory, that magical layer of vegetation that exists between the great trees and the forest floor. Here, young trees wait patiently for their turn in. The sun, when a massive old oak finally falls, creating what ecologists call a light gap. These patient saplings suddenly find themselves in a race toward the newly available sunlight. But this isn't a simple race of growth. It's a complex negotiation with shadow and light. The young trees that were living in deep shadow must now adapt to direct sunlight, while the shadows cast by the fallen giant create new patterns of light and darkness across the forest floor. Some plants will flourish in these new conditions, while others, perfectly adapted to the previous shadow regime, may struggle. The forest is constantly rewriting its shadow patterns, and life is constantly adapting to read these new chapters. Trees themselves are master shadow architects. The shape of a tree's crown, the angle of its branches, the size and arrangement of its leaves, all of these features have been sculpted over millions of years of evolution to work with light and shadow in the most efficient way possible. A tree's canopy is not random. It's a carefully designed solar collection system that maximizes the capture of sunlight, while minimizing the shadows cast on the tree's own lower branches. But trees also use shadows as tools. The deep shade beneath a large tree isn't just a byproduct of the tree's light collection. It's often a deliberate strategy. By casting dense shadows, a tree can suppress the growth of competing vegetation around its base. reducing competition for water and nutrients in the soil. This is nature's version of territorial control, achieved not through aggression, but through the strategic deployment of shadows. The relationship between forests and shadows becomes even more fascinating when we consider how trees communicate with each other through what scientists call the Wood Wide Web network of fungal connections that links the root systems of different trees. When a tree is struggling in deep shadow, it can actually receive nutrients from nearby trees that are receiving more sunlight. Transferred through this underground network, the forest, in effect, shares its light energy through shadowy underground channels. Animals, too, have evolved intricate relationships with shadows that go far beyond simply seeking shade on a hot day. The animal kingdom is filled with creatures who have turned the interplay of light and shadow into art forms of survival, communication, and beauty that would make any human designer envious. Think about the zebra, whose distinctive stripes have puzzled scientists for generations. Recent research suggests that those bold black and white patterns aren't primarily for camouflage in the traditional sense, but rather for creating a kind of shadow confusion that disrupts the vision of biting insects. The sharp contrast between light and dark stripes creates optical illusions that make it difficult for flies and other pests to land accurately on the zebra's skin. The zebra, in essence, wears its own shadow camouflage system, but perhaps no group of animals has mastered the art of shadow manipulation quite like the big cats. A leopard's spotted coat isn't just beautiful, it's a sophisticated shadow mimicry system. When dappled sunlight filters through forest canopy, creating moving patterns of light and dark on the ground, the leopard spots allow it to virtually disappear into this natural shadow dance. The cat becomes part of the forest's shadow architecture, a living extension of the play between light and darkness. Tigers have taken this shadow artistry even further. Their vertical stripes perfectly mimic the shadows cast by tall grasses and bamboo stems. When a tiger moves through its natural habitat, it doesn't just hide in shadows. It becomes a shadow, its stripes creating the illusion that it's simply another pattern of light and dark in the vertical forest. Birds have their own sophisticated relationships with shadows. Many species time their daily activities around the shadow patterns in their environment. The roadrunner of the American Southwest, for instance, uses shadows for thermoregulation in a way that's both practical and elegant. In the cool of the morning, it seeks out sunny spots to warm up, but as the day heats up, it moves strategically from shadow to shadow, using the shade patterns cast by desert plants to stay cool while hunting. Some birds use shadows for navigation. Research has shown that certain species can read the shadow patterns cast by the landscape below them, using these patterns as a kind of aerial map. The shadows cast by mountains, valleys, and forest edges create distinctive patterns that experienced birds can read like a road map, helping them navigate across vast distances during migration. Predator birds, like hawks and eagles, have learned to use the sun and shadows as hunting tools. They often position themselves so that they're attacking from the direction of the sun, making them difficult for prey to see against the bright background. They've learned to read the shadow patterns on the ground below, understanding that small movements in shadows often indicate the presence of prey. But it's not just the big, dramatic predators that have mastered shadow techniques. Some of the most sophisticated shadow users in the animal kingdom are tiny creatures that most people never notice. Take the jumping spider, a little arachnid no bigger than your fingernail. These spiders are visual hunters with eyesight that rivals any camera, and they've learned to use shadows with remarkable precision. A jumping spider will position itself so that its shadow falls in a specific way, sometimes using its shadow to herd prey into the right position for a perfect pounce. They understand that their shadow can be detected by potential prey, so they've learned to control and position their shadows as carefully as a photographer positions lighting for a portrait. Many nocturnal animals have evolved to live in the world of shadows in ways that seem almost magical. Owls, for instance, have developed feathers that allow them to fly in almost complete silence, making them living shadows that move through the night without disturbing the acoustic landscape. Their feathers are designed with special fringes that break up the air currents that would normally create sound, allowing them to become shadow-silent hunters. The relationship between animals and shadows becomes even more intriguing when we consider how shadows affect animal behavior and social structures. Many species have what scientists call shadow personalities. They behave differently in bright light than they do in shadows or darkness. Some animals become more social in shadows, while others become more solitary. Some become more active, while others become more cautious. Fish provide some of the most beautiful examples of shadow behavior in the natural world. Schools of fish often move in synchronized patterns that create shifting shadow displays on the lake or ocean floor. These shadow patterns can confuse predators, making it difficult to pick out individual fish from the constantly moving mass of shadows. The fish aren't just swimming together for protection. They're creating a kind of underwater shadow theater that serves as a form of collective camouflage as the Earth tilts and turns in its ancient orbit around the sun. Shadows become the hands of a vast cosmic clock, marking time in ways that are both precise and poetic. Every creature on Earth, from the tiniest insect to the largest whale, lives by this shadow calendar, responding to the subtle changes in light and darkness that marked the passage of seasons. In the depths of winter, when the sun hangs low in the sky even at midday, shadows grow long and lean, stretching across the landscape like sleepy cats. These winter shadows are different from their summer cousins, softer, more diffuse, painted in shades of blue and purple that speak of cold and quiet, and the restful dormancy of the natural world. Watch how a bare winter tree casts its shadow on fresh snow, and you'll see one of nature's most elegant art forms. The tree's delicate branches create intricate lace patterns on the white ground, each twig and bud casting its own tiny shadow to contribute to the overall design. These shadows are sharp and clear in the winter air, unblurred by the heat shimmer of summer or the humidity of spring. Animals read these winter shadow patterns like a calendar, understanding that the long, lean shadows mean it's time to conserve energy, to move more slowly, to seek shelter and warmth. Bears, reading the shadow calendar, know when it's time to seek their winter dens. Migrating birds understand that shortening days and lengthening shadows signal the time to begin their epic journeys to warmer climates. But it's not just the length of shadows that changes with the seasons. It's their color, their quality, their very character. Winter shadows in snow country take on a blue tint that comes from the way snow reflects and scatters light. These blue shadows are one of the most beautiful phenomena in the natural world, creating landscapes that look like they've been painted with watercolors in shades of blue and white and silver. As winter gradually gives way to spring, the shadow calendar begins to turn new pages. The sun climbs higher in the sky each day, and shadows begin to shorten and change character. Spring shadows are livelier somehow, dancing with the movement of new leaves and swaying grasses. They flicker and move in ways that winter shadows don't, animated by the energy of growth and renewal that characterizes the season. Spring is when many animals use shadows for courtship displays. Male birds understand that the right shadow can enhance their plumage, making their colors more vibrant and their displays more impressive. A male cardinal singing in dappled shadow light creates a very different impression than one singing in harsh, direct sunlight. The shadows become part of the performance, adding drama and beauty to the age-old dance of attraction and selection. Plants, too, respond to the changing shadow calendar of spring. As the sun climbs higher and shadows shorten, plants that have been dormant all winter begin to stir. They can sense the changing quality of light, the different angle of shadows, and they respond by sending up new shoots and unfurling new leaves. The shadow calendar tells them when winter's danger has passed and it's safe to invest energy in new growth. Summer brings the shortest shadows of the year, sharp and dark and brief. At high noon on the summer solstice, shadows nearly vanish altogether, shrinking to small dark pools directly beneath objects. These summer shadows are intense, offering precious relief from the heat of the sun. Animals and plants alike treasure these brief shadows, using them as cooling stations and rest stops. In the heat of the day, the summer shadow world is a place of extremes, brilliant light and deep shade, with very little middle ground. This creates opportunities for dramatic contrasts in the natural world. Summer thunderstorms, for instance, create some of the most spectacular shadow displays on Earth, as towering cumulonimbus clouds cast vast moving shadows across the landscape, creating temporary regions of twilight in the middle of bright afternoon in desert environments. Summer shadows become literally life-saving. Desert animals have evolved sophisticated shadow-seeking behaviors, timing their activities around the brief periods when shadows are available. A desert fox understands the shadow calendar so well that it can predict exactly when the shadow of a particular rock or bush will provide the right amount of shade for a midday rest. As summer gives way to autumn, shadows begin to lengthen again, but they take on qualities that are distinctly different from either winter or spring shadows. Autumn shadows are golden, tinted by the warm light of the lower sun and the colored leaves that filter and reflect that light. These are shadows with personality, shadows that speak of harvest and abundance and the bittersweet beauty of change. Many animals use the lengthening shadows of autumn as a signal to begin preparations for winter. Squirrels gathering nuts, birds building up fat reserves for migration, bears eating voraciously to prepare for hibernation. Of these behaviors are triggered, at least in part, by the changing shadow calendar that tells them winter is coming. The autumn shadow calendar is also a time of spectacular natural beauty. The low angle of the autumn sun creates conditions perfect for what photographers call golden hour light, where everything is bathed in warm, honey-colored illumination that makes shadows soft and colors rich and saturated. This is when the natural world puts on its most impressive shadow display, with every leaf and branch and blade of grass contributing to a landscape that seems painted with liquid gold. Water creates some of the most mysterious and beautiful shadow phenomena in the natural world. Unlike the solid, predictable shadows cast by rocks and trees, water shadows are fluid, dynamic, constantly changing with the movement of waves and currents and the changing angle of the sun. Stand beside a clear mountain stream on a sunny day, and you'll witness one of nature's most enchanting shadow displays. The moving water creates shifting patterns of light and shadow on the stream bed below, patterns that dance and flicker in constant motion. These shadows aren't static. They're alive, moving with the water. creating an ever-changing kaleidoscope of light and dark that can mesmerize anyone who takes the time to really watch. Scientists call these caustics, the bright, dancing patterns of light that water creates when it focuses and disperses sunlight. But the shadows between these bright patterns are equally fascinating. They create a kind of underwater landscape that exists only in the interplay between light and water. Visible but intangible, beautiful but ephemeral. Fish understand water shadows in ways that we're only beginning to appreciate. They use the shadow patterns on the stream bed as camouflage, positioning themselves where the natural light and shadow patterns will help them blend into their environment. A trout lying motionless in dappled water shadows becomes nearly invisible, not because it's hidden in darkness, but because it's hidden in the complex interplay of light and shadow that the water creates. Ocean shadows are different from stream shadows, deeper and more mysterious. When you dive beneath the surface of the ocean, you enter a world where shadows take on three-dimensional qualities. Shafts of sunlight penetrate the water at angles, creating underwater cathedrals of light and shadow that extend down into the blue depths. These underwater shadows are not sharp and defined like their terrestrial cousins. They're soft, blurred by the water, creating gradual transitions from light to dark that have an almost dreamlike quality. Marine animals have evolved remarkable adaptations to life in this underwater shadow world. Many deep-sea creatures create their own light through bioluminescence, essentially becoming their own shadow casters in the eternal darkness of the deep ocean. But even in the shallower waters where sunlight penetrates, fish and other marine animals use shadows in sophisticated ways. Schools of fish create moving shadow formations that can be seen from above the water surface. These shadows serve multiple purposes. They help individual fish hide within the group. They can confuse predators. And they create visual signals that help the school move and turn in coordination. The shadows cast by a school of fish are like an underwater language, communicating information about the group's size, direction, and intentions. Coral reefs exist in a world of underwater shadows that rivals any terrestrial forest for complexity and beauty. The coral formations create intricate patterns of light and shadow in the water, with each coral head casting its own shadow and creating its own microenvironment of light conditions. Fish that live on coral reefs have evolved colors and patterns that work specifically with these underwater shadow patterns, creating some of the most beautiful camouflage systems in the natural world. But perhaps the most spectacular water shadows occur during certain weather conditions. When storm clouds gather over water, they create vast moving shadows that race across the surface, turning the water from bright blue to deep gray in moments. These cloud shadows on water create some of the most dramatic natural light shows on Earth. As patches of sunlight and shadow move across the water surface in constantly changing patterns, waterfalls create their own unique shadow phenomena. As the falling water breaks sunlight into millions of tiny droplets, each one acting like a tiny prism and lens. The shadows cast by waterfalls are complex and beautiful, often surrounded by rainbows and other optical effects created by the interaction of sunlight with water droplets. These waterfall shadows are dynamic and powerful, changing constantly as the water volume and angle of sunlight change throughout the day. Even something as simple as rain creates fascinating shadow effects. During a light rain, the tiny droplets in the air can create what meteorologists call a rain shadow areas, where falling rain blocks sunlight and creates patches of shadow that move across the landscape with the weather. These rain shadows are temporary and delicate, visible only under the right conditions. But they add another layer to the complex shadow world that exists all around us. Frozen water creates some of the most beautiful and complex shadow effects in nature. Ice formations like icicles, frozen waterfalls, and ice caves create shadows that are enhanced by the optical properties of ice itself. Ice can act like a lens, focusing and dispersing light in ways that create spectacular shadow displays enhanced by refraction and reflection in polar regions, where ice dominates the landscape. Shadows take on qualities that exist nowhere else on Earth. The white ice and snow reflect light in ways that can create multiple shadows. An object might cast one shadow from direct sunlight and another, softer shadow from reflected light. These polar shadow landscapes are subtle and beautiful, painted in shades of blue and white and silver that create some of the most ethereal natural beauty on our planet. Mountains are perhaps nature's most dramatic shadow casters, creating effects that can be seen from space and felt across entire continents. When you stand in the presence of a great mountain range, you're witnessing some of the most spectacular shadow architecture on Earth, where geological time and cosmic cycles come together to create beauty on a scale that humbles human imagination. Every morning, as the sun rises behind a mountain range, the peaks create long shadow fingers that stretch across valleys and plains, temporarily turning daylight landscapes into realms of purple and blue mystery. These mountain shadows are not just large versions of ordinary shadows. They're weather makers, climate shapers, creators of their own atmospheric environments that can influence conditions hundreds of miles away. The phenomenon known as a rain shadow demonstrates how mountain shadows can literally shape the climate of entire regions. When moisture-laden air hits a mountain range, it's forced upward, cooling as it rises and dropping its moisture as rain or snow on the windward side of the mountains. By the time this air descends on the other side of the range, it's dry, creating what meteorologists call a rain shadow, a region of reduced precipitation that exists in the shadow of the mountains. Some of the world's great deserts exist in rain shadows. The Mojave Desert exists partly because it lies in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Patagonian Desert in South America exists because the Andes mountains block moisture from the Pacific Ocean. These desert regions aren't just coincidentally located near mountains. They're literally created by mountain shadows, showing how shadows can be powerful enough to shape entire ecosystems across vast areas. But mountain shadows affect more than just precipitation patterns. They create temperature variations that can be dramatic and origin. The shadow side of a mountain can be significantly cooler than the sunny side, creating different growing conditions that support entirely different plant and animal communities. Swiss farmers have known this for centuries, using the different shadow environments on north-facing and south-facing slopes to grow different crops and support different types of livestock. The daily cycle of mountain shadows creates a kind of natural clock that mountain communities have used for thousands of years. Before modern timekeeping, people living in mountain valleys could tell time by watching the progression of shadows across familiar peaks and ridges. The shadow of a particular peak reaching a certain point in the valley might indicate noon, while the shadow covering a certain meadow might signal the time for evening chores. Mountain shadows also create unique optical phenomena that exist nowhere else. Alpenglow, the rosy light that illuminates mountain peaks at dawn and dusk, is created by the interaction between mountain shadows and atmospheric light scattering. When the sun is below the horizon from the viewer's perspective, but still illuminating high peaks. Those peaks glow with a beautiful pink or orange light that seems to come from within the mountains themselves, another spectacular mountain shadow phenomenon is the Brocken spectre, where a person's shadow is cast onto a cloud or fog bank, creating a ghostly giant figure surrounded by rainbow-colored rings. This effect occurs most commonly in mountains, where conditions are right for the formation of the fog banks necessary to see the phenomenon. Mountain climbers and hikers sometimes report seeing these shadow figures, which can be startling and beautiful when encountered unexpectedly. The vegetation on mountains responds to shadow patterns in ways that create distinct bounds, zones of plant life at different elevations. The timberline, the elevation above which trees cannot grow, influenced not just by temperature and precipitation, but by the shadow patterns created by the mountain's topography. Areas that receive more sun exposure can support tree growth at higher elevations than areas that spend much of the day in shadow. Animals living in mountainous regions have adapted to life in environments where shadow patterns change dramatically with elevation and season. Mountain goats and sheep understand the shadow patterns of their territory intimately, using sunny spots for warming up in the morning and seeking shaded areas during the heat of the day. They know which slopes will be in shadow at different times of day and different seasons, and they plan their movements accordingly. Mountain shadows also create unique challenges and opportunities for human activities. Mountain climbers must understand shadow patterns to plan their routes and timing. A route that's comfortable in morning shadow might become dangerously hot in afternoon sun, while a path that's pleasant in sunny conditions might become treacherous when it falls into shadow and temperatures drop rapidly. The shadows cast by mountains can extend far beyond the mountains themselves, creating shadow effects that influence weather patterns across entire continents. The Rocky Mountains, for instance, cast what meteorologists call a lee shadow that affects weather patterns across the Great Plains. When storm systems encounter the Rockies, they're disrupted in ways that create distinctive weather patterns. In the shadow of the mountains, hundreds of miles from the peaks themselves. In some mountain regions, the daily progression of shadows has become part of the cultural landscape. Villages in the Swiss Alps, for instance, are often positioned to take advantage of specific shadow patterns, built in locations that provide sun during the short winter days but shade during the heat of summer. The architecture of these mountain communities reflects centuries of understanding about how to work with, rather than against, the natural shadow patterns of the landscape. Mountain shadows also play a role in the formation of distinctive mountain weather phenomena like valley fog and temperature inversions. When mountain shadows create cool, stable air in valleys, this air can trap moisture and pollutants, creating fog layers that fill valleys while peaks remain clear. These shadow-influenced weather patterns create some of the most beautiful and dramatic mountain scenery, with peaks emerging from seas of fog-like islands in a white ocean. As our day's journey through the life of shadows continues, we begin to see how these simple phenomena, the absence of light, become complex, beautiful, and essential elements of the natural world. From the forest floor to mountain peaks, from desert sands to ocean depths, shadows are not just passive byproducts of light, but active participants in the grand drama of life on Earth. Deep in the caves of Lascaux, tens of thousands of years ago, a human being held a flickering torch against the rough stone wall. As the flame danced, so did the shadows, creating the world's first cinema on the uneven surface of the cave. This ancient artist, whose name we'll never know, discovered something profound about shadows that still moves us today. They realized that shadows could capture the essence of life itself, freeze a moment of movement, and speak to the soul in ways that words could never reach. Picture this scene with me for a moment. The cave is filled with the warm, golden glow of firelight on the walls. Magnificent creatures seem to come alive, bison charging across the stone, horses galloping through eternity, deer leaping with grace that transcends time. But here's the beautiful secret that archaeologists have discovered. Many of these paintings were deliberately placed where the natural contours of the cave wall would create shadows when lit by torchlight. The ancient artists understood something. We're only beginning to appreciate again that shadows aren't just the absence of light. They're partners in the dance of visual storytelling. When that prehistoric artist held their hand against a cave wall and blew pigment around it, creating the first human handprint, they weren't just making art. They were creating a shadow made permanent. A moment where the ephemeral nature of shadow was captured forever in ochre and mineral. That handprint, pressed against stone 40,000 years ago, whispers to us across time, I was here. I cast a shadow. I existed. It's one of the most moving examples of how shadows have always been intertwined with our deepest human need to leave a mark, to be remembered, to prove that our brief dance with light and darkness mattered. The torch would flicker, and suddenly, the painted animals would seem to move. A bison's head would turn, a horse's legs would gallop, a deer would bound across the wall. These ancient cinematographers understood that shadows bring static images to life, that the interplay between light and dark creates the illusion of movement and breath. They were the first directors, using shadow and flame to tell stories that would captivate audiences for generations. As we move forward through the centuries, we find that every culture developed its own relationship with shadows in art. In ancient Egypt, shadow wasn't just an artistic element, it was a spiritual concept. The Egyptians believed that a person's shadow was one of the 5 essential parts of the human soul. They called it Shut, and they believed it contained the essence of a person's being. This is why Egyptian art so carefully depicts shadows and silhouettes, why tomb paintings show the deceased with their shadows intact, ensuring their complete spiritual journey into the afterlife. The shadow portraits carved into tomb walls weren't just artistic choices, they were acts of love, preservation, and hope. A wife commissioning her husband's tomb painting would insist that his shadow be rendered perfectly, because without it, his soul would be incomplete in the afterlife. These weren't simple silhouettes. They were portraits of invisible parts of the human spirit, captured in stone to last forever, to last forever. There's something primal that happens when we encounter shadows, something that reaches back to our earliest ancestors who learned to read the landscape of light and dark for survival. When you walk alone at night and see your shadow stretching long behind you under a streetlight, what do you feel? There's often a tiny shiver, a moment of recognition that makes you acutely aware of your own presence in space. This reaction isn't just cultural, it's woven into the very fabric of our psychological makeup. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, understood this connection so deeply that he made it the foundation of some of his most important work. He spoke of the shadow not just as a visual phenomenon, but as a psychological one, the parts of ourselves that we keep hidden, the aspects of our personality that we don't want to acknowledge. Jung realized that just as physical shadows are created by objects blocking light, psychological shadows are created by the parts of ourselves that we keep from the light of consciousness. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly beautiful. He understood that shadows both physical and psychological, aren't enemies to be eliminated. They're necessary partners in the dance of being human. A world without shadows would be flat, lacking dimension and depth. Similarly, a personality without shadow, without the full spectrum of human complexity, would be incomplete, lacking the richness that comes from embracing all aspects of ourselves. This is why children are so fascinated by their shadows. Watch a toddler discover their shadow for the first time, and you'll witness pure wonder. They'll wave at it, try to step on it, run from it, play with it for hours. In that innocent play, they're actually engaging in profound psychological work, learning about the relationship between their inner self and their external presence in the world. They're discovering that they have an impact on their environment, that they take up space, that they exist in relationship to light and other objects. The psychology of shadows extends into our deepest fears and comforts. Many people are afraid of shadows, especially moving shadows that seem to have a life of their own. This fear has ancient roots. Our ancestors needed to be cautious of shadows that might hide predators or dangers. But shadows also provide comfort. Think about the last time you sat in the dappled shade of a tree on a hot summer day. The interplay of light and shadow created a sense of peace, a feeling of being held and protected by nature itself. Therapists have long understood the healing power of working with shadow imagery. Art therapists ask clients to draw their shadows, to explore what their shadow might be feeling or thinking. This isn't just metaphor. There's something about externalizing our internal experience through shadow work that creates profound shifts in understanding and healing. When we draw our shadow, we're acknowledging all parts of ourselves, bringing the hidden into the light, not to eliminate it, but to integrate it. The phenomenon of seasonal affective disorder shows us how deeply our psychology is connected to patterns of light and shadow. As the days grow shorter and shadows grow longer, some people experience profound shifts in mood and energy. It's as if our internal emotional landscape mirrors the external landscape of light and shadow. We are beings who have evolved in rhythm with the sun, and our psychological well-being is intimately connected to these ancient patterns of illumination and darkness. Even our language reveals this deep psychological connection to shadows. We talk about shadowing someone to learn from them, being in someone's shadow when we feel overshadowed, or having a shadow of doubt. These aren't just metaphors, they're expressions of lived psychological experience. We understand instinctively that shadows represent relationship, influence, and the complex interplay between presence and absence. Something magical happened in the studios of Renaissance artists that changed the way humans would see and create art forever. It was the moment when painters discovered that shadows weren't just dark shapes to be filled in, but the very breath that could bring a painting to life. Leonardo da Vinci, sitting in his workshop with candlelight flickering across his latest work, realized that the key to making his subjects look real wasn't just in capturing their features. It was in understanding how light and shadow played across every curve and surface of the human form. Da Vinci called this technique chiaroscuro, literally meaning light-dark in Italian. But it was so much more than a painting technique. It was a philosophy, a way of understanding that life itself exists in the interplay between illumination and shadow. When you look at the Mona Lisa's face, what makes her seem so alive, so present, isn't just her enigmatic smile. It's the way Da Vinci used shadows to give her face dimension, to make her seem to emerge from the canvas as if she was sitting right there in the room with you. The artists of this period understood something profound about human perception. They realized that we don't see objects as flat shapes with outlines. Instead, we see them as volumes existing in space, defined by how light falls across their surfaces and where shadows naturally form. This wasn't just an artistic insight, it was a psychological one. They understood that the human eye and brain are constantly interpreting shadows to understand the three-dimensional world around us. Caravaggio took this understanding even further, creating paintings where dramatic shadows weren't just artistic effects but emotional experiences. In his painting of Judith beheading Holofernes, the shadows don't just define the figures, they create the mood, the tension, the very atmosphere of the moment. The darkness seems to pulse with drama, making viewers feel like they're witnessing the scene firsthand, rather than looking at a painting on a wall. These Renaissance masters discovered that shadows could tell stories that the illuminated parts of a painting could never tell alone. A shadow falling across a character's face could suggest mystery, inner turmoil, or hidden knowledge. A hand emerging from shadow could create suspense or reveal character. They learned to choreograph light and shadow like a composer orchestrates music, creating visual symphonies that spoke directly to the viewer's emotions. The apprentices in these Renaissance workshops spent years learning not just how to mix pigments or prepare canvases, but how to observe shadows. They would sit for hours studying how candlelight fell across draped fabric, how morning sunlight streaming through a window created different shadow patterns than afternoon light, how the shadows cast by a face changed completely depending on the angle and intensity of illumination. This was their school of shadows, and it taught them to see the world with new eyes. What's particularly beautiful is how these artists understood that shadows are never truly black. Look closely at any Renaissance painting, and you'll see that the shadows are filled with subtle colors, purples, blues, browns, even hints of complementary colors that make the shadows feel alive rather than flat. They understood that even in darkness there is color, reflection, and life. Shadows became not the absence of color, but a different kind of presence altogether. This period also saw the development of perspective, and shadows played a crucial role in creating the illusion of depth. Artists learned that shadows cast by objects follow the same perspective rules as the objects themselves. A shadow cast on the ground recedes toward the vanishing point just as surely as a road or building does. This marriage of mathematical perspective and careful shadow observation created paintings that seemed to open windows into other worlds. When the first photographers began experimenting with light-sensitive chemicals in the early 19th century, they were unknowingly beginning humanity's most intimate relationship with shadows. Photography, at its heart, is the art of capturing shadows, quite literally. The word photography means drawing with light, but what we're really doing is drawing with the interplay between light and shadow, capturing the eternal dance between illumination and darkness in a single frozen moment. Those early photographers, working with cumbersome cameras and long exposure times, had to think about shadows in ways that painters never did. Unlike an artist who could paint a shadow however they imagined it should look, photographers had to work with the shadows that were actually there, had to understand how different qualities of light would translate into the silver halides of their photographic plates. They became students of natural shadow in ways that were both scientific and artistic. Ansel Adams, the great landscape photographer, once said that photography is not about the camera or the lens, it's about seeing. And what he meant by seeing was largely about understanding light and shadow. Adams could look at a mountain landscape and visualize exactly how the deep shadows in the valleys would contrast with the bright peaks, how the photograph would balance these extremes to create an image that captured not just the physical appearance of the place, but its emotional essence. Adams developed what he called the zone system, a method of understanding exposure that was essentially a philosophy of shadows. He divided all the tones in a photograph into 11 zones, from pure black to pure white, and taught photographers to pre-visualize how the shadows and highlights in their scene would translate into these zones. It was a way of thinking about photography that treated shadows not as problems to be solved, but as essential elements of visual music. The invention of flash photography created entirely new possibilities for the relationship between photographers and shadows. Suddenly, photographers could bring their own light to any situation, could create shadows where none existed, could eliminate shadows that nature had provided. But the best photographers understood that this power came with responsibility. They learned to use artificial light not to eliminate shadows entirely, but to shape them, to create more flattering or dramatic shadow patterns than natural light might provide. Portrait photographers became masters of shadow choreography. They learned that a shadow falling across one side of a face could create mystery and depth, that the soft shadows created by window light could be more flattering than the harsh shadows of direct sunlight, that the direction and quality of shadows could completely change how a person appeared in a photograph. Great portrait photographers weren't just capturing faces, they were capturing the conversation between light and shadow across the human form. The development of cinema took this relationship with shadows even further. Early filmmakers quickly realized that moving shadows could create mood and atmosphere in ways that static paintings never could. German expressionist films, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, used dramatic, angular shadows to create psychological landscapes that reflected the inner turmoil of their characters. These weren't just visual effects, they were emotional architecture, using shadow to build worlds that existed as much in the mind as on the screen. Color photography presented new challenges and opportunities in the relationship with shadows. Photographers discovered that shadows aren't really black or gray, they're filled with reflected colors from the surrounding environment. A shadow cast on snow might be blue from reflected sky light. A shadow under a tree might be green from reflected leaves. Color photographers had to learn to see these subtle color relationships, to understand that shadows are just as important in color photography as highlights, sometimes more so. Digital photography has revolutionized our relationship with shadows. Once again, now photographers can precisely control the brightness and contrast of shadows in post-processing, can bring out details hidden in dark areas, can create shadow effects that would have been impossible with traditional film. But the best digital photographers understand that technical capability isn't the same as artistic vision. They still need to understand the emotional and aesthetic language of shadows, how shadows communicate mood and meaning to viewers. Long before humans could capture shadows with cameras or paint them on canvas, they were weaving shadows into stories, using the interplay of light and darkness as a fundamental language of emotion and meaning. Every culture's literature is filled with shadows, not just as descriptive elements, but as characters in their own right, as symbols that carry profound meaning, as metaphors that help us understand the deepest truths about human experience. Think about the shadows that dance through your favorite stories. In Peter Pan, the shadow isn't just a visual phenomenon, it's practically a character. something that can be lost, something that represents the connection between the physical and the spiritual self. When Peter's shadow refuses to stay attached, it's not just a magical quirk of the story. It's a metaphor for the disconnection between our public selves and our inner nature, between who we appear to be and who we really are. Edgar Allan Poe understood the psychological power of shadows better than perhaps any writer before or since. In his stories, shadows aren't just atmospheric details. They're repositories of fear, guilt, and hidden truth. The shadow that falls across a room in a Poe story carries emotional weight. It suggests secrets lurking just beyond the reach of light, truths that the characters aren't ready to face. Poe's shadows have agency. They seem to move with purpose, to reveal and conceal in equal measure. In The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson created one of literature's most famous explorations of the shadow self. Hyde isn't just Jekyll's evil twin, he's Jekyll's shadow made manifest. The parts of his personality that he kept hidden from the light of Victorian respectability. The genius of the story is how it makes literal the psychological truth that we all carry shadows within us. Aspects of ourselves that we prefer to keep hidden but that nonetheless influence our actions and choices. Japanese literature has a particularly nuanced relationship with shadows, influenced by centuries of aesthetic philosophy that finds beauty in the interplay between light and dark. The concept of wabi-sabi celebrates the beauty of imperfection and impermanence, and shadows play a crucial role in this aesthetic. In traditional Japanese poetry and prose, shadows aren't obstacles to beauty. They are essential components of it. A garden is most beautiful when dappled light creates patterns of shadow and illumination that change throughout the day. The novelist Junichiro Tanizaki wrote an entire essay called In Praise of Shadows, exploring how traditional Japanese culture found beauty in the subtle interplay of light and shadow rather than in bright illumination. He wrote about the pleasure of eating from lacquer bowls in dim light, where the food seemed to emerge from and dissolve back into shadow, creating an eating experience that was as much about mystery and suggestion as it was about sustenance. For Tanizaki, shadows weren't the absence of beauty. They were beauty's most sophisticated expression. Western literature has its own rich tradition of shadow symbolism. In Plato's allegory of the cave, shadows represent the difference between appearance and reality, between the world as we perceive it and the world as it truly is. The prisoners chained in the cave mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself, only learning the truth when they are freed and can see the objects that cast those shadows. It's a metaphor that has influenced thousands of years of philosophical and literary thought about the nature of knowledge, perception, and truth. Shakespeare was a master of shadow imagery, using it to create mood, foreshadow events, and explore character psychology. In Macbeth, shadows aren't just atmospheric details, they're psychological landscapes. Lady Macbeth's famous sleepwalking scene takes place in the interplay between candlelight and shadow, her guilt manifesting in her inability to bear full illumination. The whole play exists in a world where moral clarity has been obscured, where right and wrong exist in shadow relationship to each other. Modern literature continues to explore the rich, metaphorical possibilities of shadows. In magical realism, shadows often take on lives of their own, becoming characters that can act independently of their casters. In psychological thrillers, shadows represent the unconscious mind, the hidden motivations that drive characters toward actions they don't fully understand. In romance novels, The interplay of light and shadow creates intimacy, suggestion, and emotional atmosphere. Children's literature has always understood the power of shadows to capture young imaginations. From the shadows that become monsters, under the bed to the shadow puppets that tell stories on the wall. Children's books use shadows to explore themes of fear, courage, imagination, and growth. These stories teach children that shadows aren't necessarily things to be afraid of, but phenomena to be understood. Partners in the rich, imaginative life that makes childhood so magical. The relationship between literature and shadows reveals something profound about human nature, our need to find meaning in the interplay between revelation and concealment, between what is shown and what is suggested. Great writers understand that sometimes the most powerful truths are found not in direct statement, but in the shadows between words, in the implications that dance around the edges of what is explicitly said. As we journey deeper into the life of a shadow, we find ourselves looking upward, beyond the familiar shadows cast by trees and buildings, beyond even the gentle shadows that play across our daily lives. Here, in the vast theatre of the sky, shadows take on a grandeur that speaks to something profound within us. These are the shadows that have guided sailors across oceans, marked the passage of seasons for farmers, and inspired poets to write about the dance between earth and cosmos. Imagine standing in an open field on a clear afternoon, watching as a cloud drifts lazily across the sun. In that moment, you witness something magical, the birth of a shadow that spans not inches or feet, but miles. The cloud's shadow races across the landscape below, temporarily cooling the earth, giving relief to sun-warmed grass, and creating a moving patch of twilight that transforms everything it touches. This is shadow on a scale that reminds us we are part of something much larger than ourselves. These cloud shadows are among the most gentle of the sky's shadow performances, but they teach us something important about the nature of shadows themselves. Unlike the sharp, defined shadows we see on sunny days, cloud shadows have soft edges, gradual transitions from light to dark. They demonstrate how shadows can be both definite and indefinite, present and elusive, solid and ethereal, all at once. The science behind cloud shadows reveals the same principles we've explored throughout our journey, but on a grander scale. When sunlight encounters water droplets and ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere, some light is absorbed, some is scattered, and some continues through. The result is a complex interplay of illumination that creates these traveling patches of coolness and calm. Meteorologists can actually track weather patterns by observing cloud shadow movements from satellites, turning these fleeting moments of shade into tools for understanding our planet's atmospheric behavior. But cloud shadows are just the beginning of the sky's shadow story. As the day progresses and the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, we witness one of the most spectacular shadow performances in nature, the approach of the Earth's own shadow. This is something most of us have seen countless times without fully appreciating its significance. As evening approaches, look toward the eastern horizon just after sunset. You'll see a dark blue band rising slowly upward. This is the shadow of our entire planet, cast against the atmosphere itself. This phenomenon, known to atmospheric scientists as the Earth's shadow or the belt of Venus, represents shadow on a truly planetary scale. Our entire world, this sphere we call home, is casting its shadow into space, and we're seeing the edge of that shadow as it moves across the sky. The soft, rose-colored band above this blue shadow is sunlight still reaching the upper atmosphere, creating a gradient from the warm colors of sunset to the cool blues of approaching night. Watching the Earth's shadow climb the sky is like witnessing the planet's rotation made visible. This shadow moves at approximately 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, the same speed at which our planet spins. In this daily performance, we see demonstrated the grand mechanics of our solar system, the way our world moves through space, carrying us all along on its journey around the sun. Mountain shadows tell another chapter of this skybound story. In mountainous regions, peaks cast shadows that can stretch for dozens of miles, creating triangular patches of early twilight in valleys and plains below. These shadows move with predictable precision, following the same mathematical principles we've explored, but their scale transforms them into something almost architectural, as if the mountains are drawing geometric shapes across the landscape with their shadows. Pilots and mountaineers know these shadows well. They've learned to read the language written by mountain shadows across the earth below. The length and direction of these shadows tell stories about the time of day, the season, and the altitude of the sun. In winter, mountain shadows stretch much farther than in summer, creating extended periods of cool shade in valleys and influencing everything from local weather patterns to the growth of vegetation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of mountain shadows is how they demonstrate the relationship between our terrestrial world and the cosmic dance of celestial bodies. When you see a mountain's shadow stretching across a valley, you're seeing the direct result of our planet's position relative to the sun at that specific moment. The shadow is like a sundial on a massive scale, marking not just the hour, but our exact place in the solar system's grand choreography. There are moments in the life of a shadow when the entire cosmic stage seems to hold its breath. These are the times when worlds align, when the gentle dance of planets and moons creates shadows of such profound beauty and significance that they have shaped human history, inspired scientific discovery, and continue to move us to wonder even today. We call these moments eclipses, but they are so much more than that simple word can contain. A solar eclipse is perhaps the most dramatic shadow performance in nature. When the moon passes between the earth and sun, it casts a shadow that races across our planet's surface at speeds that can exceed 1,500 miles per hour. This shadow, darker than any we experience in our daily lives, transforms day into night in a matter of minutes, revealing stars in the middle of the afternoon and dropping temperatures by as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The shadow cast by the moon during a solar eclipse is actually two shadows working together. The umbra, the moon's inner shadow, is completely dark. This is where observers experience totality, where the sun is completely blocked and the solar corona becomes visible as a shimmering halo around the moon's silhouette. Surrounding the umbra is the penumbra, a lighter shadow where the sun is only partially obscured, creating the partial eclipse that observers see over a much wider area. Standing in the path of totality during a solar eclipse is an experience that connects us directly to the cosmic mechanics of our solar system. The moon that creates this shadow is, on average, 238,855 miles away from Earth, while the sun is approximately 93 million miles distant. Yet the apparent sizes of these two celestial bodies in our sky are so perfectly matched that the moon can completely cover the sun's bright disk, creating what astronomers call one of the most remarkable coincidences in the solar system. This cosmic coincidence won't last forever. The moon is slowly moving away from Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year, a process that has been happening since the moon's formation over 4 billion years ago. In the distant future, the moon will be too small in apparent size to completely cover the sun, and total solar eclipses will no longer be possible. We are living in a unique era when these perfect alignments can occur, making every total solar eclipse a precious glimpse into the temporary harmony of celestial mechanics. The ancient civilizations that witnessed solar eclipses without understanding their cause created elaborate mythologies to explain these dramatic shadow events. The Chinese spoke of a celestial dragon devouring the sun, while Norse mythology described wolves chasing and catching the sun in their jaws. Hindu tradition tells of the demon Rahu swallowing the sun, and many cultures developed rituals and ceremonies to help the sun escape from the darkness that had consumed it. These mythological interpretations reveal something profound about the human relationship with shadows. When faced with a shadow so complete that it could transform the familiar daytime sky into something strange and otherworldly, our ancestors created stories that helped them understand their place in a universe that seemed both magnificent and mysterious. The shadow of an eclipse was not just a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual and emotional experience that connected them to forces beyond their everyday comprehension. Modern astronomy has revealed the precise mechanics behind eclipses, but this scientific understanding hasn't diminished their power to inspire awe. If anything, knowing how eclipses work makes them more remarkable. The fact that we can predict eclipses centuries in advance, calculate their exact paths across the Earth's surface, and time their duration to the second demonstrates the beautiful predictability of celestial mechanics while highlighting the extraordinary nature of these shadowy performances. Lunar eclipses offer a different but equally fascinating shadow story. During a lunar eclipse, it's the Earth casting its shadow, and the moon passing through that shadow as it orbits our planet. Unlike solar eclipses, which are visible only from specific locations on Earth, lunar eclipses can be seen from anywhere on the night side of our planet, where the moon is above the horizon. The Earth's shadow during a lunar eclipse reveals something beautiful about our planet's atmosphere. Instead of disappearing completely when it enters Earth's shadow, the moon often takes on a deep red or orange color. This happens because Earth's atmosphere acts like a lens, bending and filtering sunlight around the edges of our planet. The blue light is scattered away, but the red light continues through, painting the moon in warm, dramatic colors that have inspired countless observers throughout history. This reddening effect is essentially the same phenomenon that creates spectacular sunrises and sunsets, but during a lunar eclipse, we see it projected onto the moon itself. The moon becomes a canvas displaying the combined light of all the sunrises and sunsets occurring around Earth's edge at that moment. In this way, a lunar eclipse connects us not just to the moon and sun, but to the entire circumference of our home planet. As we venture beyond our solar system into the vast reaches of space, we discover that shadows exist on scales that challenge our imagination. Out there, in the cosmic deep, shadows are cast by objects so massive and events so energetic that they reshape the very fabric of space and time. These are shadows that tell stories not just of light blocked, but of gravity so intense it bends the universe itself. Consider the shadow cast by a galaxy. When we look at distant galaxies through powerful telescopes, we sometimes see dark lanes, cutting through the bright spiral arms or obscuring portions of elliptical galaxy cores. These shadows are created by vast clouds of dust and gas within the galaxies themselves, materials that will someday form new stars but for now exist as cosmic shadowcasters, on a scale that dwarfs anything in our earthly experience. These galactic shadows, known to astronomers as dark nebulae, can stretch across distances measured in light years. A single dark nebula might cast a shadow that could encompass our entire solar system thousands of times over. Yet the physics remains familiar. Dust particles absorb and scatter light from the stars behind them, creating regions of darkness that we can observe from billions of miles away. The same principles that create the shadow of a leaf on a sunny day also create the shadows that help astronomers map the structure of distant galaxies. Some of the most dramatic shadows in the universe are cast during stellar explosions called supernova, when a massive star exhausts its nuclear fuel and collapses catastrophically. The explosion that follows can briefly outshine an entire galaxy containing billions of stars. But even these incredibly energetic events cast shadows. The expanding shock wave from a supernova pushes against surrounding dust and gas, creating complex patterns of light and shadow that astronomers can observe for thousands of years after the initial explosion. These supernova shadows reveal the three-dimensional structure of the interstellar medium in ways that would otherwise be impossible to study. By watching how the shadows change over time, astronomers can map the density and composition of cosmic dust clouds, trace the paths of stellar winds, and understand how the deaths of massive stars enrich the universe with the heavy elements necessary for planet formation and, ultimately, life itself. But perhaps the most profound shadows in the universe are those cast by objects whose gravity is so intense that they trap light itself. These are the shadows of black holes, regions of space where matter has collapsed to such density that nothing, not even light, can escape once it crosses the event horizon. The shadow of a black hole is unlike any shadow we encounter in our daily experience. It's not created by an object blocking light from a source behind it, but rather by the black hole's immense gravity capturing any light that comes too close. This creates what astronomers call the photon sphere, a boundary around the black hole where light rays can actually orbit, trapped by gravity but not yet fallen past the point of no return. In 2019, the Event Horizon Telescope captured the first direct image of a black hole's shadow, showing the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. M87. This image revealed a dark circular region surrounded by a bright ring of glowing gas heated to billions of degrees as it spiraled toward the black hole. The shadow itself measured about 40 billion kilometers across, larger than our entire solar system, yet represented the silhouette of an object so dense that its physical size might be only a few dozen kilometers in diameter. This black hole shadow image represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of astronomy, requiring the coordination of telescopes around the world to create an instrument effectively the size of our entire planet. The shadow they captured was created by gravity so strong it warped space and time, bending light rays into complex paths that Einstein's theory of general relativity predicted over a century ago. The study of black hole shadows has opened new windows into understanding gravity, space, and time at their most extreme. These shadows help astronomers test the limits of our physical theories, explore the nature of space-time itself, and investigate how matter behaves under conditions that cannot be replicated anywhere else in the universe. Even more exotic are the shadows cast by gravitational lensing, where the gravity of massive objects bends light from more distant sources. When a galaxy or galaxy cluster lies between us and a more distant object, its gravity acts like a lens, magnifying and distorting the light from the background source. Sometimes this creates multiple images of the same distant object, and sometimes it creates shadow-like distortions that help astronomers map the distribution of dark matter. Mysterious material that doesn't emit light but reveals its presence through its gravitational effects. These gravitational shadow effects have become powerful tools for studying the structure and evolution of the universe. By analyzing how background galaxies are distorted by the gravitational fields of foreground objects, astronomers can map the invisible scaffolding of dark matter that shapes the cosmic web on the largest scales. As our journey through the life of a shadow draws toward its close, we find ourselves contemplating questions that reach beyond physics and astronomy into the realm of philosophy and meaning. What does it mean to cast a shadow? What can the existence of shadows tell us about light, about substance, about our place in the universe? These are questions that have occupied human minds for millennia, and they deserve our thoughtful consideration. As we reflect on all we've discovered together, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato used shadows as a central metaphor in his famous allegory of the cave, describing prisoners chained in a cave who mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself. In Plato's allegory, the shadows represent illusion, the incomplete understanding we have when we mistake appearances for truth. But perhaps we can see this metaphor from another angle. Perhaps shadows aren't illusions at all, but actual manifestations of the complex relationships between light, matter, and space that make up our universe. Every shadow tells a story of interaction. When light encounters matter, when photons meet atoms, when energy meets substance, something new is created in the space beyond a shadow that bears witness to that encounter. In this sense, shadows are not absence but presence, not emptiness but information. They are the universe's way of recording the dance between energy and matter, creating patterns that speak to the fundamental structures underlying reality. Consider how shadows reveal dimensionality. Without shadows, our world would appear flat, two-dimensional, lacking the depth and form that give meaning to space. Shadows are how we perceive volume, how we understand that objects have substance and exist in three-dimensional space. Artists have known this for centuries, using shadows and shading to create the illusion of depth on flat surfaces. But this artistic technique reflects a deeper truth. Shadows are how the universe itself demonstrates dimension and form. The temporary nature of shadows also offers profound lessons about time and change. Unlike the objects that cast them, shadows are ephemeral, constantly shifting with the movement of light sources and the rotation of our planet. They remind us that everything in the universe is in motion, that change is the only constant, and that even the most solid-seeming realities are part of a dynamic, ever-changing cosmic dance. Yet within this constant change, shadows also demonstrate predictability and order. The shadow cast by a sundial has marked time for thousands of years with remarkable precision. The shadows of eclipses can be calculated centuries in advance. The shadows cast by planets and moons follow mathematical laws that reveal the underlying harmony of celestial mechanics. In shadows, we see both change and constancy, chaos and order, uncertainty and predictability existing side by side. This duality extends to our emotional and psychological relationship with shadows. Throughout human history, shadows have represented both comfort and fear, mystery and revelation, the unknown and the familiar. A tree's shadow offers welcome relief from the summer sun, while the long shadows of evening can stir feelings of unease or melancholy. We speak of living in someone's shadow when we feel overshadowed by their achievements. Yet we also seek the shadows of quiet places when we need respite and reflection. These emotional responses to shadows aren't arbitrary or cultural. They're rooted in our evolutionary history. Our ancestors who could read the language of shadows, who understood that long shadows meant approaching night and short shadows meant midday sun, who recognized the different qualities of light and shadow throughout the day and seasons, were better equipped to survive and thrive. Our responses to shadows are written into our biology, part of the deep programming that connects us to the rhythms of our planet and solar system. Modern psychology has revealed how profoundly shadows affect our moods, our behavior, and our well-being. Seasonal affective disorder demonstrates how changes in the length and quality of shadows throughout the year can influence our mental health. Light therapy treatments essentially work by manipulating our relationship with shadows, using artificial light to recreate the shadow patterns that signal different times of day and year to our internal biological clocks. But shadows also represent something profound about our relationship with the cosmos. Every shadow we cast, from the tiny shadow of our hand to the grand shadow of our planet crossing the face of the moon, connects us to the nuclear furnace of the sun 93 million miles away. Our shadows are proof of our participation in the solar system, evidence that we are bathed in starlight, part of the grand energy flow that connects the sun to every shadow-casting object in its gravitational embrace. When we truly understand shadows, we realize that we are never separate from the cosmic story. Every shadow tells us about our position in space and time, our relationship to our star, our place on our rotating planet. The shadow cast by a child playing in a sunny park is connected to the same fundamental forces that create the shadows of solar eclipses, the dark lanes in distant galaxies, and the photon spheres around black holes. This connection suggests that shadows might be one of the universe's most fundamental teaching tools. They demonstrate principles of physics without requiring complex equipment or advanced mathematics. They show us how light behaves, how space extends in 3 dimensions, how time passes, how energy interacts with matter. In shadows, the abstract becomes concrete, the invisible becomes visible, the cosmic becomes personal. Perhaps most remarkably, shadows teach us about the nature of existence itself. To cast a shadow, an object must be substantial enough to interact with light, yet transparent enough to allow some light to pass around its edges. Shadows exist only in relationship. They require both light and matter, both source and obstacle, both illumination and obstruction. They remind us that existence is not about being isolated entities, but about being part of a web of relationships and interactions that extend throughout the universe. In contemplating the philosophy of shadows, we might also consider what it means to live consciously as shadow-casting beings. Every day we create patterns of light and darkness simply by existing, by moving through space, by interacting with the energy that streams from our star. We are participants in the ancient dance between light and matter, creators of temporary sculptures carved from illumination and darkness. This participation suggests a kind of responsibility. If we are conscious shadowcasters, part of the universe's ongoing experiment with light and form, then perhaps we have an obligation to cast our shadows thoughtfully, to be mindful of how our presence affects the patterns of light and darkness around us. This might seem like a poetic notion, but it reflects a deeper truth about our interconnectedness with all the processes that shape our world. The philosophy of shadows ultimately brings us back to wonder, that sense of awe and curiosity that drives us to look closely at the world around us, to ask questions about things we might otherwise take for granted. Shadows are everywhere, yet they're easy to overlook. They're simple enough for a child to understand, yet complex enough to reveal the deepest principles of physics and cosmology. They're temporary and ephemeral, yet they connect us to permanent truths about the nature of reality as we prepare. To conclude our journey together, let's take a moment to appreciate the profound privilege of being conscious beings in a universe where shadows exist. We live in a cosmos where light and matter interact in ways that create these temporary patterns of darkness, where energy from distant stars reaches across the void to sculpt forms and shapes on the surfaces of planets, where the simple act of standing in sunlight connects us to nuclear processes happening millions of miles away. The life of a shadow, from its birth in the interaction between light and matter to its endless transformations as our world rotates and our planet orbits. The sun is ultimately our story too. We are shadow casters and shadow dwellers, beings whose existence is intimately connected to the play of light and darkness that has shaped our planet for billions of years and will continue long after we're gone. In recognizing this connection, we find not just scientific understanding, but also a kind of cosmic humility. We are part of something much larger than ourselves, participants in processes that extend from the quantum scale to the galactic, from the briefest moment to the vast stretches of cosmic time. Every shadow we cast is a small but real contribution to the universe's ongoing exploration of what's possible when energy meets matter, when light encounters form, when the dynamic forces of nature express themselves through the simple, elegant language of shadow and illumination. Thank you for staying with me through this peaceful journey into the life of a shadow, from object to ground. Together, we've traveled from the tiniest shadows cast by individual atoms to the vast cosmic shadows that shape galaxies and reveal black holes. We've explored how shadows form and change, how they've influenced human culture and scientific discovery, how they connect us to the natural world and the cosmos beyond. I hope this exploration has given you a new appreciation for the shadows in your own life, the ones you see every day but perhaps never really noticed, the ones that mark the passage of time and connect you to the rhythms of our solar system. Tomorrow, when you step outside and see your shadow on the ground, you'll know that you're witnessing one of the universe's most fundamental processes, a simple demonstration of principles that govern everything from the smallest interactions between photons and electrons to the grandest structures in the cosmic web. If this journey has sparked your curiosity about any aspect of shadows, whether it's the physics of light, the psychology of perception, the biology of circadian rhythms, or the astronomy of eclipses and cosmic phenomena, I encourage you to continue exploring. The world of shadows is vast and endlessly fascinating, with new discoveries being made all the time by scientists, artists, and thoughtful observers like yourself. Consider taking time to really observe the shadows around you. Notice how they change throughout the day, how they shift with the seasons, how they reveal information about light sources and three-dimensional forms. Pay attention to the emotional effects of different kinds of light and shadow. Watch for the shadows of clouds, the shadows cast by the moon, the Earth's shadow rising in the eastern sky after sunset. Most importantly, remember that you are part of this story. Every shadow you cast is a continuation of the cosmic tale we've been exploring together, a personal participation in the grand dance between energy and matter that has been unfolding since the universe began. In your own small but significant way, you are helping to write the ongoing life story of shadows throughout the cosmos. Thank you for your curiosity, your attention, and your willingness to see wonder in something as simple and profound as a shadow. Until we meet again for another journey of discovery, may you find peace in the gentle rhythms of light and shadow that surround us all. And may you never lose that sense of wonder that helps us see the extraordinary in the everyday. Take care, and remember, every time you see a shadow, you're seeing the universe teaching us about the fundamental nature of light, matter, space, and time. What a remarkable gift to be conscious beings in a cosmos full of such elegant, accessible lessons about the deepest truths of existence.